Thanks a lot for the great introduction and having me tonight. I'm excited to be here and ready to talk about executive functioning. Hope everyone's excited. All right, so let me go ahead and share my screen again. Okay. All right. So we're going to obviously talk about the idea of parenting for independence and what I like to call the executive functioning bootcamp. So one of the things really to think about is that when you're giving your child or teen a strategy to help them, sometimes there's this thought, oh, let me just do this for them. It's quicker, whether it's charging your kid's Chromebook or, I don't know, helping them pack their lunch when they're more than old enough to do it themselves. But by giving them a tool to help them to do it themselves, you're going in the long run going to help them a lot more, and also actually probably save yourself time too. So we're going to talk about those types of things and more. Okay, so for most of this tonight, it's going to be very practical in terms of strategies and things like that. However, before we can get into that, I'm going to try to make this part as quick as possible, but I do want us to at least look a little bit at what executive functioning is, because it's a term that people throw around a lot, but a lot of times people don't really take the time to define it. Okay, since we're talking about executive functioning, which again, we'll define in a minute, one of the things that you might be very well aware of is it involves organization. Therefore, I thought we should make sure that we're organized tonight in terms of having an agenda for the talk. So, okay. So obviously we're going to talk about executive functioning, ADHD, just briefly because I think it connects to this. And then we're really going to talk mostly about very practical strategies. In terms of questions, what I'm going to do is I want to get through the first part of just the basic background stuff first, and then start talking about strategies. And then at that point, I'm more than happy to pause as we go and take questions, because I think it's really important to be able to have that dialogue. And I encourage people to put questions in the chat. Let me just make sure I can actually see the chat. Okay, I can see the chat. So we can definitely take questions from that and however else makes sense as we go. Okay. So what is executive functioning? Obviously, that's a big part of the talk tonight, so we should probably define it before we get too far into it. Okay, so technically, it's a set of mental processes that control many actions. So it helps people to focus, hold information in their mind, successfully complete tasks. A nice way to conceptualize it is the breakdown I have here in terms of thinking about it in different categories. So we have behavioral regulation, which is the idea of inhibiting impulses, so stopping yourself from doing something that you shouldn't be. So for example, let's say you're watching the presentation and you think, oh, I'd love to see what's going on Instagram. Can I stop myself from pulling out my phone and going on Instagram while I'm watching this? So if you can stop yourself, then you're able to inhibit your impulse. If you can't, then I guess you can't in that situation. Self-awareness is the idea of just knowing like how your actions impact others. Emotion regulation, maybe fairly self-explanatory, but it's the idea of being able to, to not get angry easily or, react strongly. But a big part also is shifting attention. Because one of the things that a lot of times, if you have kids that react very strongly to things, and sometimes it's the act of having to shift their attention from one thing to another that actually causes someone to get really angry in the moment. It's not always about the task. Like think about if you have a child and you ask them, I don't know, to bring their plate into the kitchen or something. And it seems like something sort of minor, but that act of having to shift their attention when they're not expecting it can sort of throw them off. And then cognitive regulation is probably what people think about more often with executive functioning in terms of like getting started on things, planning, following through, mental organization, physical organization, working memory. So with working with memory, if you have a task you have to do, usually you can't have every little part written down. And I mean, it's important to have steps written down in general, but you have to hold some information in your mind, even if, let's say you're going to dial a phone number. I realize with smartphones, this doesn't happen as much anymore as it probably used to, but if you are given a phone number and have to dial it, you have to hold the information in your mind from the time you look it up until you actually dial it in. Another like simple way of thinking about executive functioning is think about a factory. So like, let's say, I don't know, a car factory. So in a car factory, you're going to have, let's say, a bunch of robots, conveyor belts, putting the car together, one part at a time. And in the factory, there's a control room. And the control room is really what controls all the different pieces to put the car together. And that's essentially executive functioning. Okay, so what is ADHD? I'm just going to mention this really briefly because certainly with ADHD, I mean, it's technically a disorder that impacts attention, or really self-regulation of attention, and hyperactivity, so excessive movement, things like that. But there can be a lot of confusion between ADHD and executive functioning. So someone that has ADHD by default has executive function weaknesses because executive functioning issues sort of underlie ADHD. But to be very clear, there are many different reasons why someone may have executive function weaknesses that are not ADHD. If someone has anxiety, depression, autism, there's countless disorders and issues that can cause executive functioning issues. And I mean, certainly people can have EF weaknesses without having any formally diagnosed disorder. But it's just important to just be aware of that there's the different types of issues that can create executive function limitations. The good news, though, is we're going to talk a lot about even whether your kids' skills are good and you want to improve a little bit, or they're really not that great. There's definitely a lot of room for improvement and we're going to work on that tonight. So this way you can my goal really is to have you guys take as much tangible stuff home with you. Well, I guess you guys are probably already home, but most likely, but take sort of the very concrete stuff that you can then apply even as early as tonight to try to make this as helpful as possible in better assisting your child or teen. And I think you may pick up some tips for yourself as well along the way. Okay, so how do EF issues impact school functioning? I mean, again, some of these are probably self-explanatory, but I do just briefly want to go into this because there may be things that you don't really think about that are connected. So trouble staying focused in class or difficulty concentrating. Those things, obviously attention plays a large role in executive functioning, because if you're not focused on what you're doing, it's going to be really hard to execute a task and get it done. I mean, if I'm, sitting, playing, let's just say, if I'm fiddling with this, if I'm like that, clearly I'm not able to fully focus on what I'm supposed to be doing, which is giving a presentation. So the idea is you have to be able to harness focus in order to get stuff done, or to engage in whatever the task at hand is. And so obviously focus or attention is quite vital. In terms of executive functioning things, getting started on work can often be very difficult when you have weaknesses in executive functioning, trouble planning ahead. Even if you have situations, for example, I don't know if any of you can relate to this, where, you've told your child a million times, don't do whatever it is. And they keep doing it, and sort of once the consequences pass, have absolutely no recollection. It's as if those 100 times they've done something they shouldn't have and had that consequence have never even occurred. And following multi-step directions can often be a big area of difficulty as well. Okay. So again, in staying organized tonight, we have now, in trying to bring up a little bit too, we've now a visual explanation of our agenda for the practical strategies. As you can see, some icons are easier to find than others on PowerPoint. Some, I think, do a very good job representing. A few maybe not quite as good as I would like, but I think that they serve their purpose. Okay. So before we're almost there. We're one more slide, and then we're to the meat of today, the very practical strategies. So the one thing that I want to just mention is that I'm going to talk tonight, but one size does not fit all with everyone for a variety of different reasons. Just because I say, here's a strategy that could work, it doesn't mean it's going to magically work in exactly the way I'm explaining it for your child, because, based on your child or teen's age, if they have ID, if they're a non-reader, various other things, or certain learning issues, there are different reasons why things really may need to be tailored to your child's individual needs. And so I just want to make sure that that's sort of clear from the start. And in addition, think about the title of the presentation, Parenting for Independence. So the idea too is, to the extent that you can, you want to really open a dialogue with your child or teen about what you want them to work on, get their input on how they envision what they could see as being helpful. Because a lot of times, or most of the cases, if you get their buy-in, this is going to go far better in terms of they're going to be more motivated to make these changes themselves. They're going to use be more willing to use strategies. Whereas if you say, you have to do this, in exactly this way with no room for flexibility, unless your child really is that compliant, you're probably going to end up having more battles about it. Okay, so got into the important stuff, and I think we're actually not too bad in terms of timing as far as how long it took us to get to this point, because I like to be efficient. And so let's think about keeping track of assignments. All right, so I mean, the basic principle with it is that you want to have your child have a place where all assignments are listed. And I realize a lot of times with Canvas or whatever school portal sort of your child uses, if they have one, if the assignments are all listed in there, theoretically that's one place you could look, and that's important. But a lot of times the way that those portals are set up, there's so much information in there that it can be really overwhelming for a child or teen to look at that. And it still requires holding a lot of information in your mind. Because remember, I'd mentioned how working memory is a big part of executive functioning. But when you look at a portal, if you look at either class by class or you look at the calendar view, there's still a lot you have to hold in your mind to think, oh, these are the assignments I need to do. But if you write them down in a way, whether it's, and there's flexibility, you could write it on a whiteboard, a paper list, obviously, paper planner, certainly for a lot of kids, especially if you're not on a computer much during the day, would make a lot of sense. Or there are some electronic programs you can use. So one of my favorite ones to use is called My Homework. It's great. I mean, it's like $4.99 a year for the premium version, which, given what it does, is actually, I don't know why they don't charge more, but I'm glad they don't. But basically, it's essentially it's an electronic version of a homework planner, but it syncs with most platforms like Canvas, Schoology, things like that. And so the idea is like any assignments in there automatically get fed, because basically the way it works is you can almost all types of school portals have a calendar link, and pretty much you can export the information from the calendar link into whatever program supports it. And so My Homework is nice because instead of just putting it in as a calendar event, it basically translates it into a task list. So then you can see all the assignments in one place, but you can also plan it out. So let's say you have 10 assignments in there, but you're not going to work on all 10 assignments in one night. You could click a button and move the assignments to, like, let's say a high priority. So like, let's say there are 5 assignments I would work on. I can put those in a separate list. And then once I've made my plan for the day, I don't have to, go to, keep going back to look at all the assignments. I just have to look at the few that I've said I'm going to work on today. So it's a nice program. There are other ones like that as well. My Study Life's another one that's pretty similar. But also the thing to think about is, again, as I've said before, one size is not fit all. So for some kids, a formal homework planner may make a lot of sense and be great. For others, they may find it overwhelming, or they may say, I don't want to use this. But so the idea is you also want to start as simple as possible. So for example, if you're going to do it electronically, for anyone that has a school email account that's essentially a Google account, you actually have Google Tasks already built into what you're using. And so it's a really simple task list. It's fascinating. So if any of you have like a school email account, or your kids do, and you're on the Google Chrome web browser, if you look on the far right side of the page, there are a bunch of little icons, like there's usually 31 for the calendar and some other ones. I think maybe, I don't know, a year ago, Google put them on, but they really don't advertise it, but there are all these buttons that are right there for all these programs. And so you can open up Google Tasks in the same window as your email account, or probably what's even more helpful for kids, in Google Docs. I mean, given how much a lot of kids use Google Docs, basically you can have your task list in the same window. So anytime you open up a Google Doc, all your list, what you have to do is right there. And if you get assignment notifications by email, you can click a button and the assignment automatically gets transferred to the list. So, again, everyone's different in terms of their interests, what they need, things like that. Certainly for younger kids, I think there are definitely a lot of benefits of, having stuff more on paper. But if you have a child that really can't keep organized, or, has handwriting issues, there are definitely a lot of benefits of, thinking about it electronically. Plus also you can print it out. So like once a child sets their plan for the day, if they really have a lot of stuff that's not on a computer, they can print out the list. They don't have to be on the computer or an electronic device to use it. I mean, there are certainly other programs like Trello or Google Keep that, for some kids work really well if they really don't like fitting into a certain structure and want to set up stuff themselves. For other kids, having that flexibility makes it a lot harder. So again, this is where I think individual differences really come in trying to figure out what system may work, best for them. And sometimes, I mean, as great as it would be if any strategy set up worked perfectly the first time, I mean, I would say probably like 99.9% of the time, whatever strategy you set up is probably not going to work perfectly the first time. But it's also really important to use what's working, what's not working as a learning process. So if you realize something works, look at why is it working and how can you translate that same idea into other things too. If it's not working, decide, was this a terrible idea? Should I scrap the whole thing? Or was it really, it would have worked fine, but I need to tweak the implementation better. Okay, in terms of planning out time and completion of assignments. So, for some people, this stuff may seem self-explanatory and obvious. For others, maybe not as much. And so, it's important to really look at the basics. That if when you're thinking about your child or teen and helping them to get their homework done, you want to figure out when do they actually have time to do their homework. I mean, for some kids, they come home right after school and they have several hours or more. For others, they do sports or other activities, and time's more limited. Or maybe they come home for a little bit, then go back out to sports practice. So what you want to help them to figure out is to look at their schedule each day, and it might be different depending on the day of the week, but to help them to figure out when do they even have time to do homework. And then from there, figuring out, based on what assignments they have, help them to figure out, like, what do they, especially when stuff's not all due the next day, like how long are assignments going to take? So if I pick 5 assignments to do and I have absolutely no idea how long they're going to take, I have no idea if a plan I make is actually going to work or not. But if I estimate the completion time and I say, I think maybe this will take about 20 minutes and this maybe math worksheet 15 minutes, and then I make a list and I figure out the total estimated times an hour and a half, and I have 2.5 hours free, then I know this plan is certainly going to work, or it's likely to work. Because probably one of the things I hear the most when I make a suggestion to someone about making a plan is they feel like it's never going to work perfectly. So as soon as they start a plan, they're going to fail. Planning is really important, but you also have to have flexibility with it. And so I think that's just a key thing to really keep in mind. And obviously this goes beyond school stuff. Certainly things with work, stuff around the house, for parents, all sorts of stuff. Having flexibility in making a plan is really important. Okay, so I thought I would create a little bit of a visual in terms of an idea, just to give you a sense of a daily plan. And my suggestion would be to have this written down, or ideally work together with your child or teen to make this plan. You could do it, on a whiteboard. If they're on their computer anyway, you could help them put in Google Calendar. Or, for younger kids, if they're going to be on an electronic device, there's all sorts of apps. And there are a couple, I think, on the slides at the end, and I'll go through that you can use for visual checklists and things like that. But, in general, the main thing is you want to have it easily visible, whether it's electronic, on a whiteboard, on paper. The idea is you want it to be something that they can see easily, because if they have to log in somewhere to see it, or it's on, the refrigerator, but they don't actually go into the kitchen at all anywhere around the time they're doing homework, it's probably not going to be as helpful. So as you can see here, I put a start time. So one of the benefits when you're thinking about homework is to have a general start time based on the day to start work, because especially if your child has a lot of time free, it may even be harder to start homework, because if they have no sense of, I need to measure this up by a certain time, it's much easier to say, oh, I'll do this later, I have all evening. And then suddenly it's 10 o'clock at night and they haven't started. Hopefully it doesn't get quite that late without them starting, but again, you also have to work it around your schedule and who's available. If your child or teen needs a lot of help with homework, you obviously have to be mindful of, when someone's available to help them with it. As you can see here, I also put a break in. So one of the things that's really important is to think about breaks, because if someone keeps working nonstop for too long, they're going to get so fatigued that they're naturally going to zone out, and then they're not going to be as productive. And then sometimes by working too much without a set break, it leads to sort of just getting off task, but sometimes getting off task for so long that it's hard to rein it back in. Whereas if you can kind of take a break, quickly enough before you completely lose focus, then in turn, you can actually work for longer periods of time and be more productive. And so, and everyone's different. Some people, or it may work where you do it, I don't know, after you finish a certain assignment. For others, it might be better based on a certain time period. The other thing too, is there may be times where instead of estimating how long an assignment's going to take, you do it based on a certain period of time. So for example, I gave the example of an English paper. So if you work on the paper, let's say you say I'm going to work for 20 minutes, then it's more of a set time as opposed to an estimation. So you say I'm going to work for this specific time. Okay. In terms of physical workspace and general organization, and again, some of these are probably pretty self-explanatory, but again, sometimes one of the things I found with this is that it's often the simplest things I find that work the best. It's often not, really like complex, system. I mean, first of all, the more complex something is, the more likely it is with executive function issues not to work. So like the idea really is, find like a combination of the simplest strategies that you can use that work to accomplish whatever the task is. So with physical workspace, obviously you want to keep things, as minimal as possible in terms of distractions. So, but you also want to be realistic in terms of like helping your child or teen to be able to focus wherever they are. So whether, they have like a space they can only use for homework, which most kids do not have their own office. So, I realize in most cases they're going to use, whether it's a kitchen table or, a corner in a living room or the library, wherever it is, the idea is trying to make that space their own in that moment. Even if, let's say, as soon as they're done, they move everything and have dinner in the same place, if you can figure out a way to make it a different space in that moment. So whether it's even at the kitchen table, maybe it's a different placemat when they're doing homework, or you set up a science board as a little bit of visual barrier to reduce distractions. Even with the phone, imagine, especially for older kids and teens, I hear this a lot that, a lot of them will say, I need my phone to do homework. Sometimes there may be some truth to that. Other times it's, I just want to play on it. But, the idea here though, is if a child or teen really needs their phone for homework, one way of kind of creating essentially a boundary with it would be to set it up in different ways. So instead of holding it normally, maybe put it on a dock and use a keyboard or something with it. So this way, like you're constantly being reminded that you're using it in a different manner, which suggests that, you should be using it for homework. One of the other big things with working that's important to keep in mind is that, I don't know how, this probably goes for adults too, in terms of the number of tabs that you have open. But if you have a lot of tabs open, especially at a point where you can't even see what the tabs are, then anytime you go off of whatever you're doing to then go to something else, if you either click a tab by accident or see a tab that's interesting, there's that initial second you're gonna think, am I gonna stay on task, or let me just look at this for a minute? That's often one of the times where people can get off task easily. So in general, it's better if you can to try to minimize the tabs you've open and use things like bookmark, especially on the bar where you can sort of see it in front of you. Or even another thing that's cool with Google Chrome is you can also group tabs together. So if, let's say you want to open all your assignments, if they're all online for the night at once, you could basically, open them up and then save them as a group. And then this way they're right there, but you can then, or have like the ones you're not working on in a group and then keep the ones separated that you're working on. So this way they're all open easily, but you don't have to constantly see them. And by the way, please feel free, if you guys want to ask questions at all, as we go at this point too, please feel free to, I guess, if you want to do it in the chat, we can, or if that doesn't work, just let me know and we can figure out the best way to get questions. I'm happy to start taking questions as we go too. Okay. In terms of general organization, the first thing is obviously you want to follow whatever requirements or recommendations a teacher has. Like if a teacher says they want you to organize a binder in a certain way, obviously you should follow that. One of the things that I've often found helpful, and again, this gets at this idea that sometimes the simplest things work the best, is if you have a child or teen that comes home and their backpack is just filled with all these loose papers, One thing I found to be that often works really well is if you get them to keep a manila file folder in the front of the backpack. The idea is like having a rule that anything that would otherwise get thrown loose into the backpack in terms of paper gets put in the folder. And then you could file the papers, each night in the right place. Because if you think about it, for that kind of folder, you don't actually even have to take it out of the backpack to put the papers in. So if you have an older child or teen that carries their backpack around, literally they can, if they in the same place they're sticking their hand in to put the paper in, could just stick it in the folder without even taking the folder out. So just, kind of just one general suggestion to think about with organization. Other things along those lines too are, think about, how a child organizes their desk. I mean, again, I realize you don't have a lot of control over that, because most parents are not really at school with their kids regularly or at all these days. But, thinking about just the logic of thinking about, maybe the order that you put folders in based on what class you have first and second and third, or how certain materials if you don't use them as that much, maybe keeping them in the back of the desk or in a cubby or wherever else. And same thing with, even like a workspace at home. That like the stuff that you need regularly, it's often better like keep it within arm's reach. So like basic school supplies, but don't have a ton of stuff on the desk beyond or work area beyond what's actually needed, because then it's going to lead to potentially more distractions. Okay. I know a big thing that people often worry about, and definitely understandably so, is helping kids to stay on task at school. And I do think that there's some differences in how you approach this, whether if a child's like on a Chromebook or if it's doing something on paper and pencil. I mean, either way, as I'm sure everyone here can agree and probably has seen, people can get distracted, whether there's a screen or not. But I think sometimes there are different ways to approach it. And so I figured I would kind of go through some ideas. Okay, so one of the things that you can do if you have a child or teen that naturally fidgets, rather than like having them just stop, is so what happens. This is one of my favorite things is the idea of harnessing fidgeting to improve focus. So it's the idea that if you're naturally moving anyway, by doing the movement in a controlled way and something that's mindless, it actually tricks your mind into thinking you're more interested in something than you are, and so you in turn can actually focus better. And there's research behind this as well. So so I think that there's a lot that you can do with it. And I'll I have a slide in a little bit on fidgeting, so I'll get into a little more depth in a few minutes on that. But the main thing is at school, I mean, kind of like I'm suggesting at home, only have items on desks that are needed. If you have a child that has a bunch of books that they just put on the table that they're not or on their desk they're not using, probably they're more likely to pick it up when they get bored and start reading instead of doing whatever they're doing. I think in terms of other stuff, I mean, for some kids, they can plow through, classwork and get it done, and that's it. For others, they might do a problem or two and then start to zone out or get distracted and talk to a classmate. So, for kids that really need it, being able to basically break like let's say it's a whole worksheet to do, break it into chunks. So maybe they do 2 problems and check in with their teacher, or maybe they, I don't know, are allowed to do 2 problems and then get a drink of water. I mean, each person's different, and you obviously have to be mindful of like how the class is structured, what the teacher can do, because you want to be mindful of not sort of asking for something that's going to be a burden on them, but working collaboratively with them to figure out based on what works for them, what kind of systems can be set up. Definitely, creating incentives as needed, can be helpful. I mean, but again, it's the idea is you don't want to set up stuff in a way where kids get in this habit of trying to earn stuff for everything they should be doing normally anyway. But I think sometimes if you can do it in a controlled way, especially temporarily, just to develop a habit, then it can often work in the short term. I mean, I think also when you have a child or teen that maybe like isn't particularly interested in a certain subject or a certain type of work at school, that maybe figure out if there's something that they can get out of it they haven't thought about. So let's say if a child that really doesn't like math, maybe the math itself is not as interesting, but maybe they could see some value in, this is actually a skill I could use, to do X, Y, or Z outside of school, or something that would be useful later if that's enough of a motivator. Other things that can be really helpful for staying on task at school are things like timers. I mean, certainly there's no shortage of different types of timers. both electronic and sort of handheld. I mean, everything from a sand timer to there's a company called Time Timer that makes these little timers that are like this big. Actually, they make some big ones too. What's cool about those is so you set it, and basically the part that like at the start time is shaded red, and then it gradually kind of gets less and less. But so it helps your child to sort of see how much time they have left for something. Because you also want to think about time in terms of helping them to visualize it. Because if like with a digital timer, I mean, certainly for like being reminded of something can help, and there's still certainly benefits of digital timer, but having something where you can actually like visualize the time in a way, can often be more meaningful. I mean, it's kind of like there's another one called 360 Thinking that has a timer app where basically it's a picture of an analog clock, and it's essentially divided up where you have the yellow part is like the early phase of whatever you're doing. The green is kind of like the bulk of your time. And then there's a few minutes that's the red. So like when it gets to the red, it's the time that recognizes, oh, our time's almost up. I mean, technically you could do the same thing with a regular analog clock. If you get like a dry erase marker, you could, draw on the clock and like, shade it with different colors. And then, just you could see on the clock where you are in that time. So, I mean, there's obviously ways that don't involve electronics at all. Well, I guess a clock probably is, I guess, electronic in some sense, but not in the sense of an app. Another thing that often works well for some kids is a thing called a Pomodoro timer. So there's this idea that you can only stay focused optimally for a certain period of time. But if you basically, work for, let's say 20, I mean, technically the official time is like 25 minutes on, 5 minutes off, but you can certainly do it, especially for younger kids, much less. Like even if you did 5 minutes on and like a minute or two off, the idea is basically by taking breaks frequently enough, it can help someone to be able to basically be more productive during the time that they're supposed to be working. And, in turn, sort of be able to work for longer periods of time without getting as tired. Okay, so now we're going to talk a little bit about staying on task at school and Chromebook. I don't know. I'm guessing probably more people may be interested in this than the off-screen stuff, but in terms of staying on task, both are important. But I realize that, I mean, I certainly hear far more about concerns around kids getting distracted on Chromebook than off task. Okay, so obviously the Pomodoro timer that I mentioned before, can be one way, and there's actually you can go to if you type Pomodoro timer into Google, there's some free ones that pop up that you can use. And so this way, kids from the front, as long as, I mean, I assume they're probably not blocked, but I guess you never know, but you can just check and see. But, if you type Pomodoro timer in, actually, and Google even has its own timer as well, if you just type, X minute timer. But basically, you can easily, without downloading a software, use timers on the computer, and then and if you have the ability to add Chrome extensions, some of them have Chrome extensions, but you certainly don't need those. Another tool that can often be helpful, some kids really like these, some find them extremely annoying, are they make these vibrating watches, like Watchminder is one example of them, where it's essentially I guess it's technically a smartwatch, but it doesn't connect to a phone or anything, at least not, this one doesn't, where basically you can set a vibration to go off at certain intervals. So whether it's every 5 minutes, every 10 minutes, it's kind of like a high-tech way of a teacher getting a student's attention every time they've zoned out. And so the idea is by having those vibrations, it either jolts you if you've lost focus, so you don't lose focus for too long at once, or if you feel it, it can often over time become a reminder to stay focused. Kind of like sort of the idea of I mentioned breaks. And so, it's definitely important to take breaks in general, but with a screen, it's also important, not just for fatigue, but I guess even for your eyes and other health reasons. So at this point, I mean, I guess we're all pretty much on a screen at this moment. So maybe, how about all of us, why don't we take 20 seconds and just look away? It gives everyone kind of a nice break, an opportunity to kind of clear their eyes for a few seconds. Okay. I don't know. Hopefully you guys feel at least a little bit more energized, or at least some semblance of a little bit better from that very brief break. Okay, so I mentioned earlier about minimizing the tabs, keeping tabs open. So again, I think that's important. In terms of other things to stay on task. So I have a couple of suggestions I think could work really well. Again, I don't know if all of these are available like on the school Chromebook, depending on what gets blocked, but there's some Chrome extensions. So there's a cool one called Forest Focus. So what happens is basically when you activate it, a tree grows like for whatever period of time you set. So if you say, I want to focus for 20 minutes, so a tree grows, and if you try to deactivate the program before the time's up, it says it will cut down the tree. So, first, kids seem to really like this. Adults actually too, that, it's sort of, it pulls at this idea of, do I really want to have a tree get cut down because I decided to get off task? And you can actually set it up where it blocks certain websites, but you can also run it without blocking websites. Other Chrome extensions that can often be helpful are dayboard and mindful browsing. So what these do is you can actually have like a little like mini task list in the new tab. So anytime you try to go to a new tab, it shows you what you're supposed to be doing, and it asks you, do you really want to go there? So like for some people, whether you're a kid or adult, sometimes that split second extra reminder of, should I be doing this? It can sometimes be enough to stop yourself from going on something that you're not supposed to be doing. Okay. In terms of some other suggestions for reducing distractions at school, in the classroom, and again, this depends obviously on, what's available, what's permitted, and so again, I always encourage parents, it's always important to talk to your teacher and any other, professional at the school that makes sense to based on individual circumstances to make sure whatever you need is allowed, or to figure out sort of a suitable alternative if whatever you would like to do just doesn't work with the school. But having a file folder or some sort of visual barrier can be really helpful just as a basic thing. It's again another use for the file folder I mentioned earlier from the backpack. It's also great when you can reuse things too. If feasible, noise canceling headphones or earplugs can sometimes be helpful, especially for kids that really have a hard time blocking out auditory distractions. This is pretty self-explanatory, but having kids sit away from peers that they're likely to talk with. I think and again, I realize a lot of times it may be assigned seats, but I think just being aware of, which kids your child works well with, which they don't, and to the extent that, the teacher is aware of that, hopefully they can kind of help guide that a little bit as well. Okay, in terms of reducing distractions at home, so I mentioned before some Chrome extensions. Some other things you can also do there are some formal programs you can get, like Freedom is one where you can set it where it'll block certain websites and computer programs, because the Chrome extensions only block anything you access on the web browser. Whereas these programs will actually block stuff on whatever, on not just the web, but also any sort of computer game or things like that. And so you can actually set them to go automatically. And again, especially for kids that are at least mid-elementary school or older, if you can try to get their buy-in and set this with them, they may be more receptive to it. But the idea is you could have it set up where maybe from, I don't know, 4 to 6, everything's blocked. And then the idea is if they're done with homework by 6, then they can have access to stuff. Or if you want them to take a break, you can do it in multiple blocks. So you could say from, I don't know, 3:30 to 4, it's unlocked, and then at 4 o'clock it locks itself. So this way it deactivates YouTube at 4, so your child can't just keep watching YouTube past the time they're supposed to start their homework. And then maybe, I don't know, they get a break from, 4:45 to 5, so for 15 minutes, stuff gets unlocked. Cold Turkey is similar to Freedom. Cold Turkey does offer an interesting add-in where you can lock the computer screen on a typing program, and you set the parameters. So basically you could say, write 100 words, write for 20 minutes, and the computer won't unlock past the typing screen until you fulfill that thing that you set. Again, it can work well, but again, you also want to be very, there's a thing where it asks, are you sure before you set it, but you definitely want to be careful. I've occasionally had kids that have been really tired when they set it and set things that really don't make sense that take a really long time to accomplish to unlock the computer. So you just obviously have to, probably for older kids that can work better. I'd also encourage you to think about, using stuff that's built into devices you're already using. So, I mean, one thing to keep in mind, so with a Chromebook, I'm sure most of you are probably at least somewhat familiar with a Chromebook at this point, but so if you log into a Chromebook and you log in under school, or your child logs in under a school account, you usually don't have much control over parental controls because it's whatever the school sets. Technically, if you basically log in under like a child's personal account on a Chromebook and then add the school account as a sub account under theirs, it gives you more control over some of the parental controls. Occasionally there are things that don't always work perfectly. So it's sort of a trade-off to decide what's needed, but that is also another way to have some parental controls even on a school account when they're doing homework. Also using, things like if they have an app, iPad or something, using screen time or, whatever, comes with Android devices this way, or, some of those things can really be helpful. And really the idea though, is you want to teach kids to over time regulate it for themselves. So having some limits and, the formal, sort of app stuff in place to start is good because it takes away some of the conflict. Because if the iPad goes off at a certain time, instead of your child, you having to say your child time's up and then they start battling it out to want more time, it goes off automatically and there's less of a dispute about it because it's preset. Okay, and again, please feel free to ask questions. I sort of figured we'd have questions by now, but obviously a few more slides and a few more some stuff to actually show you, and then we will, I'll formally open it up for questions. Okay, so again, this is one of my favorite things, harnessing fidgeting to improve focus. So there's a lot that you can do for this. So for example, I mean, in terms of the idea is you want it to be mindless, first of all. So, I mean, all fidgets are not created equal. I mean, for anyone that remembers the fidget spinner, I mean, it's pretty much been banned in any school. I feel like right before the pandemic, I think I saw it on clearance at Beth Beyond or something. So, I mean, clearly, I think it's on its way out. But basically, I mean, that was, I think, mismarketed because it was initially, I think, marketed for anxiety. Because, I mean, it's true, it's distracting, so it takes your mind off stuff, but it's not really a good fidget to help improve your focus. But so the idea with fidgets is that you want them to be mindless, so you can do whatever you need to do with that. So for example, I mean, if I have ones I can just juggle with, they're probably not, it could be kind of distracting, I would imagine. But I mean, there's a lot of different kinds. So you can, for example, on Amazon, you can buy, packs of, I don't know, countless ones for 10 or 15 bucks. But basically, ones, for example, one sort of, like this, ones that are pretty much you can hold and, kind of like this, where, I'm obviously I'm holding it, I'm not looking at it, really paying attention to it, but it's sort of there. So it's creating a little bit of extra movement. Whereas obviously if I'm playing with this, clearly I can't fully focus because a lot of times I think kids especially have this idea that it doesn't matter if I fidget with something, I'm still listening. But what's being missed is that even if you're listening, you're missing the visual attention piece if you're not looking at what you're actually doing. I mean, given how much people do stuff with their hands for school, one of the other things that I think gets thought about even less is how can you use your feet to fidget? So I'm going to show you some things. Some of these I realize can maybe be fine in school if you have permission. Others I think are a little more meant for home and doing homework. But okay, so on a practical level at school, something like this, these are kick bands. Basically, you put them on the chair. Your child can put their feet down. So they can basically explain it. Essentially, let's see. So kind of pull up, pull back, and so the idea is it's kind of mindless. Plus, also, if you have a child that switches classes a little bit, I mean, it may be hard in middle school, but at least for elementary school, if it's only a couple times a day, these are pretty easy to take on and off. For things at home, so things like a desk bike, basically you can stick it under wherever the child's working, and they can pedal while they're working. I mean, the goal is not, I mean, I would not use this as their primary method of exercise for the day, but the idea is sort of by pedaling, slowly getting sub movement in, it can allow them to be able to focus better. I don't know. I mean, I have fun with them. I have like a elliptical version under my desk I use sometimes, and it's nice because it's just a nice way to get some extra movement in during the day. Okay, some other ideas are something like this, like a balance board, where you can put your feet on it and kind of move it up and down a little bit. Or if you have kids that like more of like a sort of a sports oriented one, I mean, you can do little, make wider boards that are closer to like a skateboard or a snowboard. One other thing to think about with the fidgeting is that sometimes it doesn't even involve the hands or the feet. So another idea is either a wobble chair, or they make things like a wobble cushion. And so what's great is you can sit on it, and by basically just by sitting, you have to move a little bit to sort of stay still. And so it can help a lot, because then it's just a nice extra way. Again, these you'd have to figure. I mean, I've seen some situations where kids use it at school, but especially in younger grades. But again, each school is different. But certainly at home, these can work well, or you can use it under their feet. There's lots of different options. Okay.
Dr. Heller, we have a couple questions in the chat. The first is, those worked really well for my son. And Ms. Harp, I'm not sure which one you were referring to. Do you have any suggestions for a high schooler? She said the bands.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, so in terms of the high school level, I mean, I guess they're like, I would try to think about like being as creative as you can. So I realize the high school level, it might probably stand out a little more if your high schooler is having the, having to, the bands or carrying them around from class to class. But think about it, is there something that they could have with it? Like, for example, could they have something, I don't know, attached, that they have a binder under their desk? Could they have something that they tap on? Like whether it's, I don't know, if it's like a special, like a binder with like a cushion on it or something where they could put, like, so for example, I mean, I think like this itself would be hard to do at school, but like, for example, like something like this, which is like, I mean, it's just like a foam pad, you could basically attach, and these are actually sticky. So you could basically, if you stick it to the back of a binder, you could basically push, like, so they could like push their feet up and down, and like the extra cushioning, it's not quite the same as the bands, but it might give them a little bit of movement, and it could be very discreet because no one's going to pay any close attention to the fact that just assume it's a cover and a binder. Okay, we have a question on, do you share feedback about youth who need fidgets, but it almost becomes a challenge for them to destroy it? I mean, certainly some fidgets are easier to destroy than others, but I mean, I think if that's sort of their goal, then probably like thinking about like something that's sort of not a true fidget might make sense. Like whether it's, I don't know, some sort of putty, or actually this, I mean, again, I don't know for sure this would work in all schools or be allowed, but like something like this, if especially if it's like a strength thing, because basically you just squeeze it. And so the idea is, if a child is playing with stuff and is otherwise going to destroy stuff, by squeezing something, it sort of gives them extra opportunity to kind of get their tension out. I think they make some smaller versions of those too than that one, but. I mean, a lot of it too is also just, thinking about like, it doesn't even have to be like a formal like fidget that you buy. I mean, you can, use what you have at home, whether it's, stuff from a pillow, or like, or even like, if you take like, let's say felt, and I don't know, stick some sort of like pillow, like stuffing in it, and then sew it up. I mean, you can, make different kinds of stuff too. I mean, in fact, I mean, if your child was interested, or certainly if they're, crafty, have them work on making their own fidget. Okay, I guess any other questions right now? Okay, so I guess I'll go ahead to the last slide. The last slide is actually a sort of a resource of a lot of different programs that can often be used in different ways. A lot of these I mentioned, but there are a few I think I haven't at this point. So helping kids keep organized. I mean, a lot of times I think trying to help them to write down as much as they can. Because like a common thing is a lot of kids will say, oh, I want to keep this all in my head, whether it's trying to remember their homework assignments but basically figuring out the simplest way for them to write it down. Like if you have a child or teen that has a cell phone, think about how many different apps come built into the phone that, I mean, it amazes me when I work with kids, how many kids I've asked that have never actually opened the calendar on their phone, or the notes app or the reminders app. And so the idea is there are all these tools that are there, and just, encouraging your, kids to use them can be helpful, or also think about what you can do in terms of modeling this kind of these actions. So if you're thinking about planning, I don't know, something, you need to figure out logistics or something, maybe like, especially if they have an electronic device, have a family calendar or shared task list, or other things that could be really helpful are, if you have like I know some people don't like these, and obviously not everyone has them by any means, but like an Amazon, like Alexa or Google. Sorry if anyone's Alexa went off, Amazon Echo went off, but things like that can sometimes be helpful, because I mean, kids as young as like 4 certainly can use that sometimes to set reminders. They also do actually make kids versions of it as well. But the idea here is then it creates an opportunity. Like if you figure out like what systems you use to remember stuff, and not just encourage your kids to use them, but actually like have them see you using it, sometimes that can work better, because sometimes if you just keep telling your kid you do this, do that, they're not going to listen. But if they see you doing it, so if they see you adding an event to your calendar, setting a reminder on your Amazon Echo or whatever it is, or even it doesn't have to be tech related. I mean, it could be writing a note on the refrigerator or a sticky note by the front door to not forget something. Like figure out what systems you use, and by sort of having your kids sort of see that also can help with helping them to sort of start trying to use some of the stuff themselves. In terms of the tools listed for staying on track, so Toggle it's a time tracking app. So when I talked earlier about the idea of time estimations, so one of the hard things is a lot of people are not good at time estimations. So the question is, how do you become better at it? One way is to actually track your time, because by actually tracking your time, it gives you a sense of how long things take. So for example, I mean, if I ask someone, how long does your homework normally take? I mean, that's kind of a loaded question, because one, it depends what assignments you actually have, and you may not have the same homework each night. But if, let's say, you have a math worksheet each night, if it's roughly the same amount of problems, there's a good chance it's going to take roughly the same amount of time. So if you track it each day for a week and keep track of how long it takes, then you actually will probably have a much clearer sense of how long that particular assignment takes. Or think about reading. So if, let's say, you have a child or teen that's reading a chapter book, and they want to figure out how long do I need to allot to read this book. So if you have them read it, assuming the chapters are about the same length, or for textbook too, if they read a chapter and time themselves, then there's a good chance that however long it took them, it'll take them roughly that same amount of time when they read subsequent chapters. So by kind of just really like focusing on kind of the nitty gritty of how long things take and breaking it down, it can really help kids, and adults too, to improve sort of their efficiency by knowing how long things will take. I mean, think about, times where if, like, let's say your child has, 15, 20 minutes, and when they get home and then suddenly they have to go, to soccer practice or something, that, if they think, oh, this will take 5 minutes, and it turns out it takes an hour, they're not going to get very far into it before they have to go to practice. But if they know how long something actually takes, they could actually get some stuff done in that 15 minutes before they go to soccer practice. In terms of calendar apps, obviously Google Calendar is quite common. Certainly it's, attached to Chromebooks for the most part. So it's, certainly a very easy one to use. But, really, I think it's more about what, if your child does have an electronic device, whatever the device they're using, figure out what calendar works on it. Because a lot of them are more similar than different, but they do have, like, for kids that, I think I put it on one of the earlier slides, but for the kids, for example, that don't read, there's one called CW Calendar that is, it's a picture-based calendar. And so it allows you to kind of create events, but you can do it based on pictures. And you can actually create a schedule for the day in the calendar. There's also, I think, a couple of others on there. There's a kids to-do list that's good. And these work for kids probably, maybe 3 and up. But some of them have it where it's just pictures. Some have it where you can also type in stuff too. So for kids that are just learning to read or have very limited reading skills, it also can be a way to actually practice some academic skills too, while they're keeping organized. So there's obviously a lot of new technology, but again, it's not just about the technology. I mean, whiteboards, a piece of paper, a sticky note. It doesn't have to be anything fancy. It's really the idea of each person's different. So figuring out for yourself or working with your kid to figure out what's going to work for them can often, yield the best return in terms of, things getting better and everyone being more organized. I guess, does anyone have any other questions?
Feel free to come off mute if you have a question. We have a smaller group tonight.
Hi, Dr. Heller. My name is Ebony Price. I have a high schooler, 10th grader, and my challenge is I've tried a lot of different ways to get him to organize himself. Do you have any advice when they're resistant to? Because like you said, he just wants to try to remember it in his head, but it's, with more classes and more demands, it's hard to remember everything in your head. So do you have any advice when they're a little resistant to trying some of these different tools that are out there?
Yeah, I mean, and that's certainly a common issue. I think a couple of things. I think one thing is to try to better understand, like, why are they resistant? Because, like, if when you explore that with kids or teens, there's sometimes different reasons. So some kids are resistant because they feel like having to use a tool is going to be another thing they have to remember. Or some kids, if they feel like they've tried a lot of things, it hasn't worked, or feel like they're going to get discouraged, it's going to be another thing they're going to try and fail at in terms of, like, using it effectively. So, like, better understanding, like, what's behind it. Is it just it's easier to try to remember stuff? There's a concern about they're not going to remember to use a strategy, or they feel like they've tried everything and it hasn't worked. But then, the other piece of it too is thinking about it that, like, if you can sort of get him at a time where, like, you can in a nice way sort of illustrate that this isn't working. So, like, if he, like, a time where, I don't know, he just missed a test or he has some homework assignment because his memory failed him, like, that can be another time to sort of see if maybe that's kind of a good opening to say, would you like to try writing this down, or figuring out, like, but again, it's, you want to figure out the reason behind his resistance to writing it down.
Okay, that's good.
Or,
thank you.
you're welcome. Yeah, or sometimes even, like, another way of approaching it, some kids are scared to, like, commit to a strategy because they're afraid they're gonna have to use it forever, and if they don't like it. So maybe another way of framing to him would be to say, maybe give him a couple of ideas and say, if you like any of them, why don't you try this for a week and see if it's helpful.
Oh, that's helpful. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Dr. Heller, a quick question.
Sure.
One of the issues, besides organization and fidgeting and organization, and have I mentioned organization again? One of the issues that I have with my son is the rush to complete assignments. So sometimes he can produce really good work, but this rush of having to finish because he needs to get done, he ends up turning sloppy work. Any advice on how to work with that? Something, I don't know.
Sure. Yeah. I think that, again, I think the first thing is you want to figure out, why is he rushing? Like, some kids rush through it because they just really don't want to do it. Others are afraid they're going to lose focus if they, sort of can't get through as fast as possible. So, part of it is figuring out what's behind the rushing to start. Other kids also, sometimes it's anxiety. Sometimes kids are really anxious about having a lot to do and feel overwhelmed, so they try to rush through it to get rid of that feeling of being overwhelmed. So, like, understanding, like, what's behind the rushing is a good starting point. But then from there, a couple of ideas would be, Especially like if he realizes, oh, I should actually, because there's a difference if someone realizes, oh, I should actually slow down, but I can't get themselves to do it versus has no interest in trying. Because if they have an interest in trying, things you could do would be, have them, create some sort of like a simple checklist that they use to guide them when they're doing homework. So for example, when they're reading directions, if they tend to rush through it, to have a thing saying, read all directions, or, or a simple task like rewrite directions in your own words, or some little thing that gets them along the way to kind of slow down a little bit. Or at minimum, get them to at least work on checking over their work after.
Okay.
You could also even try, the Pomodoro method I mentioned earlier. Because you're working for set periods of time, it may be that if he knows he only has to work for a set period of time for a break, that could be another way where he may end up slowing down a little bit, because he sort of has this, he knows he'll get that break and may not feel as rushed.
Okay. Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Does anyone have any other questions? I mean, certainly there's a lot on executive functioning. I mean, I would say like one thing to keep in mind is, so I realize we went over quite a bit tonight. I mean, certainly like I think it would be helpful to think about like, think about maybe one or two like key takeaways from tonight for yourself, whether it's a certain strategy or a general principle, but have like one or two kind of key things that you can take away from today. And kind of going in the idea of what we talked about, it's probably better not to rely on your memory for it. So I would highly suggest figuring out a way that works for you to maybe write down this idea, whether you do it in your phone in the Notes app, on a piece of paper, on a Google Doc, send yourself an email with it, but like having some tangible way that you can then go back on from whatever idea you just came up with for tonight and use this to work on implementing it. Because you obviously, took the time to come out tonight, which is great to hear this presentation and learn. And I want to make sure that you not only sort of have learned, but then can execute what we've talked about tonight. So I think being able to think right now about, what do you want to execute from what you've heard? Is it about the fidgets, or thinking about, setting up like a more structured homework routine, or thinking about how could your child, do stuff themselves more at school to stay on task, like whatever it is, thinking about like, what do you want them to do? How can you have a conversation with them about it to start bringing that up? Because I think the more collaborative it can be, the better. And then how can you remember yourself to do that? Because I think by putting those things together, I think this will make it much easier to be able to, take action and get as much out of this, talk as you can. Comment on apps. Yeah, I mean, it is hard. I mean, one thing to keep in mind is that there's always going to be something that could distract. Like, obviously, the more you can block the things that are super exciting, that can definitely help. But I mean, as I'm sure, a lot of adults can relate to, there's always something that could get your attention, even if it's, I don't know, a new, the icon on a computer of more new mail coming in or something. So the idea is there's on some level, there's an importance of learning how to block what you can with programs, but also recognizing that like by not even starting certain stuff. So for example, if your child can't disconnect from YouTube or Instagram, rather than saying, I'm going to go on for 5 minutes and then do something else, is don't start it. Try not to even open it in the first place until you're done with whatever you need to finish for the day. Yeah, and in terms of like phone use at school, I mean, it's hard. I think on the one hand, there's a lot of different programs you can use. Kids are also, some kids really like kind of trying to get around it and are good at it. Some programs are just not made very well. And so it is easy to get around them. But in terms of how do you get them to not open YouTube? I mean, it depends on the age of the child. I mean, for those of you that have younger kids, if you, I mean, usually like YouTube is, I think, is often blocked on certain like school computers. But even if they have a personal account, if they're under 9, you can with parental controls for Google, you can actually you can deactivate YouTube so that they can't access it. So that's one way of doing it. Certainly, you can use various programs like Freedom to block YouTube. Another way of doing it, I appreciate people sharing kind of some other different programs that can block it. I mean, another thing to also think about is that using programs where it gives you a certain amount of allotted time. So if they're using YouTube for fun and they get, I don't know, 15 minutes or a half hour, they can do that. And then it gets this, like, for example, on an iPad, after that time period, then like the app closes out and you can't access it. So like there are also, various computer programs that will do that too. And this way you can sort of block it after a certain amount of time. So that's another way of doing it. So rather than being all or nothing, is to sort of, to basically, block it after a set period of time. Another thing to also think about with it though, is, I mean, think about helping your kids to regulate it. So if they are going to use it, think about being mindful of the time before they start. So for example, if they know they only have 10 minutes, at minimum, they probably should not watch a YouTube video that's longer than 10 minutes. Or if they can, I mean, I know it's hard for a lot of kids to say, I'm gonna watch this one video and then do something else. But if there's an intention before you start, it's easier to make a plan than if you basically have no plan whatsoever and just say, oh, I'll jump on this and at some point I'll get off. I mean, the other thing too, or one other thing too, is a lot of the apps these days, I think by law, I think they may have to have, the apps do not advertise it. But if you go under settings, like for Instagram is one example, YouTube may have it. You can basically set it where it'll give you an alert after a certain period of time of how long you've been on it for. It was funny because I had when the setting had come out, I was playing around with it on Instagram, and so I set it for 5 minutes, and then I keep getting alerts saying that they won't let me set it for only 5 minutes anymore. But apparently they deactivate it as an option. You have to set it for a higher amount of time first. I guess they want you to be on the app more. But anyway, the idea is like these programs do have some of this stuff built in if you go under settings and use it. But yeah, I mean, I also think that, like, especially for older kids, because I would think about, especially for high schoolers, that, when they're out on their own after high school, that, they're, unless they like see the value in these kinds of programs or can regulate it for themselves, they're going to kind of have a problem. And so, whereas if you regulate everything and they don't really understand how to do it or have no role whatsoever in trying to do it themselves, it's going to be much harder. Whereas if you can kind of gradually give them that independence with the tools to do it and work with them on trying to do it for themselves over time, then that can often help with, easing into adulthood.
That's my worry right now with the block that we had to implement at school on his phone. I mean, he was at school, but he spent 8 hours watching videos on his phone. So we had to implement this. We are trying custodian. We are also trying Norton family to see what works. So, but right now is us doing it. It's not him learning to control himself. So that's an issue that I see in the long term, that he's always going to need somebody to stop it.
Right. Well, and there are some people that need more help longer term with this, but that's also where the idea is, like, if they can accept the help enough to like use the program themselves as an adult, then the idea is, even if they know, oh, I can't practice myself, but I'm going to set up screen time for myself or whatever the program is, then, sort of the idea, as long as they're willing to set that up, then, there is sort of help without a parent being directly involved as an adult. Mm-hmm. But the problem is, getting them to see the value in that, or recognizing that what they're doing is an issue. I mean, I guess the other thing to look at is, what is it about that, school is really hard or it's boring, or like figuring out if there's something about it that's leading him to sort of be on the phone so much, or is it more an attachment to the phone and it has nothing to do with what's around him?
Okay. Dr. Heller, this has been very useful. Thank you very much.
You're very welcome.
Yes, and unfortunately, we are right at the end of our time. It is just about 8:30, and Dr. Heller, we want to thank you for being here with us and let everyone know that he will return. This is a two-part series. He will be back on April 5th. Yvette just put the registration information and the conference website in the chat. And so we hope you can join us for additional sessions. And with that, Dr. Heller, thank you again. And we will see you again. And everyone have a lovely evening.
You're very welcome. Thanks again for having me. And thanks a lot, everyone, for joining. Hope that this has been helpful, and definitely stay tuned for part 2 on Stuff at Home in a few weeks.
Thank you very much. Looking forward to that one.